If you like this podcast, then you're going to love The Week magazine and its daily digital digests. And now is the ideal time to try it out. With analysis and opinion from across the political spectrum, stay informed this summer with The Week. Enjoy 6 weeks free, then save an extra 30% on a print and digital subscription when you enter the offer code SUMMER24 at theweek.com/offer. Start your free trial today at theweek.com/offer with the code SUMMER24. It's the week ending Friday the 19th of July, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Donald Trump surviving an assassination attempt at a Pennsylvania rally, the King's speech outlining 40 bills put forward by Keir Starmer's government, and Gareth Southgate resigning as England manager after Spain won the Euros. You can read all you need to know about everything that matters in The Week magazine, but we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the Week's digital team is Jamie Timson and the boss man, Holden Frith. And from the Week magazine, it's Leif Arbuthnot. And Holden, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Which candidate has the ear of the court?
No court has ever held that a special counsel or any official remotely like a special counsel is a principal officer. And no court has ever held until Monday morning that the special counsel is an inferior officer and the attorney general has no statutory authority to appoint him.
Matthew Seligman, a fellow at the Constitutional Law Centre at Stanford Law School, talking to the podcast Amicus on Tuesday. And Holden, I think that's what he sounds like when he's animated about something. What's the story?
Yes, this was the fallout from a judge's decision on Monday, when most of us were probably still processing what had happened on Saturday, that Donald Trump should no longer face charges that he removed secret national security documents from the White House and took them to his Mar-a-Lago resort in Florida and then refused to give them back. Judge Olly Mann, who's been running this report, said the way in which the White House appointed a special counsel to oversee the case was unconstitutional, which meant the whole case should be thrown out and the trial, which was already delayed and probably wouldn't have happened until after the election anyway, should now be cancelled entirely.
Okay, wow. I mean, you're right. This would be getting more attention if this were not the week that he had that assassination attempt and also, I guess, announced his VP, and that has totally dominated the American political headlines, hasn't it? Leif, of all of the cases against Trump, this is the one that you wouldn't think could get chucked out on a technicality. Like, we know that he had more than 325 classified files at Mar-a-Lago. We know he did.
Yeah, those were extraordinary photos, these kind of documents just hanging around. I think there were some in a bathroom, and if you were just an ally of Trump's, you could presumably have just sidled in and started flicking through these documents. So it was hoped that this case was one of the more secure ones. But Olly Mann, the judge who's overseeing it, is a Trump-appointed judge. And she's been known to kind of make Trump favourable judgments throughout the kind of process. For instance, when the FBI issued a search warrant in August 2022 to enter Mar-a-Lago, Cannon subsequently issued an order stopping the US government from reviewing the documents any further and using the materials for criminal investigative purposes. Some people would claim that she's a kind of a Trump sort of acolyte, and I've even seen it thrown about that she is aspiring to be appointed by him at some point if he gets in to the Supreme Court. This ruling is pretty extraordinary, and it's a pity in a way that it's been crowded out by other news, although obviously the assassination attempt is an extraordinary in itself. But I do think it would be leading the US news, at least, if that hadn't happened. Although I have to say it's such a complicated story, and it's so alien to people from Britain who can't understand how the US justice system works, that I can understand why maybe it might fly over the heads of people in the UK, because it's so complicated and a little bit dry even.
Yes. Well, okay, so Holden, I'll come back to you in a minute to explain exactly what this technicality was. But before we get into that, because some people will find that dry, I mean, the other bit that UK listeners struggle with, Jamie, is this idea that the former president, when he was the president last time, had the ability to appoint a judge at all. I mean, that's not how it works here, is it? And we've recently as well had the Supreme Court ruling which says that Trump has presidential immunity for decisions he made when he was president. To what extent will that have an implication on this?
Yeah, I think you can see a definite link between the Supreme Court decision on Trump's immunity and Judge Eileen Cannon's kind of decision. And a lot of the reaction to the decision this week has pointed out that you can view it through a lens of the Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, who's probably the hardest right of the justices, kind of sketching a legal roadmap in his concurrence with the view on the immunity case. And I saw it once described as, Clarence Thomas threw the pass from the quarterback and Eileen Cannon scored. There does seem to be a very obvious link between the two. And I think it goes back to what Leif was saying of this is all done through the lens of if Donald Trump is going to potentially be the next president, which is looking more and more likely, there's a lot of people in quite high places that think, well, if we can just follow this along a bit, we can get into a good enough position for themselves.
And I suppose in a sense, Holden, that's out in the open, in that Trump did appoint her. Her political allegiances are clear. That's not being covered up. But at the same time, despite what everyone will be seeking to say online about the roadmap and about the fact this is all planned and it's all about getting Trump away with as many things as possible, she is a judge. She does need to have a legal basis for saying what she's saying. So what is the legal basis by which this judge says this case needs to be thrown out?
The ruling is quite technical, and the technicalities of it surprised quite a lot of legal observers in that it goes back to how the special counsel Jack Smith was appointed. And Jack Smith was brought in essentially to be a sort of political fig leaf for the Biden administration because of the recognition that it wouldn't look good if Biden's Attorney General, Biden's Justice Department was directly going after Trump. So bringing in a special counsel as a way of establishing some sort of independence and giving a lawyer some remit to go and investigate and decide whether somebody would be prosecuted. According to this ruling, that appointment should have been approved by Congress and wasn't. This isn't something that has traditionally happened in the past because there have been many other special counsels appointed, including those who've investigated Clinton.
Yes, and that's what Seligman was saying in that clip, basically, wasn't it? This is unprecedented. This is how we've behaved since Watergate.
Yes, and I think that's one of the areas where the question of the impartiality of this judge comes to the fore, because despite the fact that US judges are political appointments, in many cases, they then establish a sort of independence and their decisions may lean in one direction philosophically or another, but they're not necessarily partisan directly in their approach. Whereas I think even the most independent of observers of how Eileen Cannon has been handling this case has suggested that whenever there has been an opportunity to take a decision that benefits Trump, she's taken it. And in fact, in an earlier stage, a decision of hers was reviewed and rejected, and she was rebuked by an equally conservative court in Florida. So there was already a close eye on her when this decision was made. And I think the nature of the decision coming out on a Monday morning immediately after the events of the weekend added to the sense that she was trying to create some sort of benefit for Trump.
Yes, and possibly deliberately cover it up. I mean, obviously there were other things in the news, including the beginning of the RNC.
Yes, and I've been following this case reasonably closely, listening to a podcast called The Trials and Tribulations of Donald Trump. In the weeks before this, they had been debating whether or not Cannon would have the nerve to go so far as to throw this case out entirely. And most had felt that she probably wouldn't, because it would be such an eccentric decision to do. And in fact, some of those who thought she would thought it may actually be a positive thing for the prosecution in the long run, because it is such a surprising decision that it creates a reasonable grounds for appeal, and the prosecution can now go to a higher court and again try to get that decision reversed, and possibly even try to get a different judge substituted into the case.
Yes, except, Leif, obviously, if Trump is president, by the time that appeal, if successful, was then returned to court, he'd be able, I think I'm right in saying, to say, yeah, we're not doing this anymore, and throwing it out himself.
Yeah, so it's quite likely, I've read, that this eccentric decision, as Holden puts it, by Eileen Cannon would be overturned on appeal. But of course, this is all part of a broader strategy from the Trump team to just run down the clock until November, when he is potentially re-elected. And if he is elected president, he could get his Justice Department to dismiss the case. And even if he doesn't get the Justice Department to dismiss the case, this long-standing policy exists where you can't prosecute a sitting president. So it's looking like it was a very successful and happy day for, Trump's kind of legal prospects when this ruling landed on Monday.
And what's happening with the sentencing of the case in New York? So that was the one that was about paying to keep the Stormy Daniels stuff out of the press, for which he's been found guilty, but the sentencing has been postponed, hasn't it?
Yeah, the New York jury in May found Trump guilty on all 34 felony counts. He is expected to appeal the verdict, but it's a process that probably won't wrap up by the time of the November election. It's the Judge Juan Merkin who presided over the case, and he found him in court, contempt of court multiple times. There's kind of 4 trials now at the moment that are up in the air. We kind of, as outside observers, really saw this one that we were talking about, the Eileen Cannon one, as being the most likely to result in a prosecution. It does feel like now with, even the Trump Georgia 2020 election interference case, they've all got appeals in review and the case is in limbo. So it doesn't feel like any of them are going to be wrapped up in time before the election.
Yes, although my understanding, Holden, is that the one, you're the one, I'm now testing you on your listening to this podcast. The one in Fulton County, Georgia, that's the one that a president can't overturn. That's the one that, for whatever reason, due to Georgia law, if you interfere in the Georgia election and they can prove that he did, it doesn't matter, even if he's president, he could be in trouble there.
That's right, because the other cases are all federal cases being brought by Biden's Justice Department. So the moment Trump became president, he would appoint a new attorney general who would have jurisdiction over any federal case and would presumably just stop them all in their tracks. Whereas in Georgia, that case is being brought under Georgia law, prosecuted by the Georgia Attorney General. And so he has no ability to overrule that. The one spanner that could be thrown in the works there
Wrench, please. We're talking to America.
I'm sticking with spanner. The one spanner that could be thrown in the works would be a Supreme Court decision which in some way extended the immunity to the acts he's accused of in those trials. But given that case revolves around him phoning the governor of Georgia and asking him to find more votes for him, it would be quite hard to construe those as official acts. So I think there is still a feeling that if that case, which has been delayed because of a kind of personal scandal involving the prosecution, if that case can be got out of that limbo and back on track, that probably now becomes the case most likely to survive a second Trump presidency.
From a Democrat point of view, Leaf, this is a disaster, isn't it? They've messed this up. How's it possible that you had these 4 cases which all had merits? Like I say, this one with the cases and boxes of files was the one that we've all seen in daylight. But all of them were arguable against him, and none of them really are going to affect his chances of being president.
Yeah, I think it is a disaster from the Democratic point of view. And also, it basically has incensed Trump voters who feel that he has been wading through legal issues that are not really warranted. Because some of these cases are so complicated and just involve the technicalities of the law, a lot of Trump supporters just feel like he's been attacked by lawfare. And so when Trump says things like, I'm going to punish people who have wronged me in whatever way he chooses to say it, a lot of Trump supporters see that as entirely justified because they believe that he has been unfairly targeted by sort of legal bureaucrats. So it is bad because almost they've swung for the big guy and they've sort of missed. So it's almost worse than them not having attempted in the first place, in my view. It's also striking how we're talking about all these cases. Obviously, he is already a convicted felon. He was found guilty of 34 felony counts in New York by this jury, and that doesn't seem to have had any sort of impact on his perceived electability by the people who support him. So, hovering over this whole conversation is a question of would it matter if he had even more kind of crimes attached to him, unless he was literally physically put in jail. I'm not convinced that it would make any jot of difference to, the wish of Americans to vote for him.
Yes, I mean, that's the extraordinary thing, isn't it? And you have to credit his political astuteness, Jamie, on that. He's turned this into the establishment is against me, I'm your anti-establishment candidate, and it's made him stronger from the mugshot through to, well, I suppose all the way through to the attempted assassination.
I think that link there from legal warfare and into like actual physical violence against him is very strong, and you could see immediately after the assassination the way that some of the right-wing news and Trump supporters were trying to link to an idea of you did this, you created this environment. And it does make me wonder, will prosecutors be a bit more squeamish about aggressively going after Trump now because of what's happened in terms of the shooting? And I think I totally agree with what Leif has said. I mean, you only have to look at the polls. Some of the maddest stuff has happened in this campaign. Biden's debate performance was one of the worst things I've ever seen from a politician in terms of debate. That hasn't really affected the polls. Everyone, it seems, in America has decided how they feel about Joe Biden and Donald Trump. And we're, 3 months still out from more, 3.5 months out from more. So I have to say, I'm with Leif. I don't see this really making a massive difference into his electability at all.
Yes, well, just briefly on that, Holden, because it's kind of not our mission statement on this podcast, because it is what everyone else is talking about. But it's such a huge story. I mean, on that, not everyone has made up their mind in the United States. Really, this whole election is playing for the tiny percentage of people that might swing between Republican and Democrat. And on that basis, it does feel like the momentum is now with Trump. If you were making up your mind which of these two candidates looks stronger, those people, it seems to me, are now going Trump.
I suppose if you were undecided this far in, that means you don't have a ideological rejection of Trump, and so yes, perhaps you do feel that he would be the lesser of two evils. It's quite hard to imagine yourself into that kind of mindset. I think the aim may be less about changing the minds of that very small number of undecided people and more about trying to make sure that the people who are broadly on your side turn out. And I think that's the real danger for Biden. Like, every news cycle of the past few weeks has really helped to discourage people voting from Biden and increased the resolve of those who may be minded to vote for Trump. And so I think that's probably where any kind of shift in voting intention would come from.
Yeah. And we were talking last week, Leif, I mean, it feels like years ago now. We were talking on this podcast about Project 2025 and what Trump might do when he becomes president and how his ambition appears to be more dictatorial than previously democratically elected leaders in the United States. The fact that he might have control over the courts in this way only feeds into that narrative, doesn't it? If you're looking and thinking, what do we expect from the next 10 years? It is a more autocratic leader.
Yes, and also feeding into that is that sense that, a bit like a bull being aggravated by a red piece of cloth, that he will go into, his term in office with a kind of grudge, against all the judges and the people below them, clerks, etc., who tried to get in his way. So it's a depressing moment. And I mean, the big question is whether he will be as bad as whether his bite will be as bad as his bark. I think that actually the first Trump presidency wasn't quite as terrible as all that. If you actually look at what happened, it was bad for America's place in the world, but there weren't that many catastrophes that you could point to. But the big question now is whether this next presidency, if he does get it, will actually be a total disaster, as some people are predicting, particularly because he probably will have gathered a team around him that are, good at doing what he wants and actually are aligned with his vision. With the first Trump presidency, he spent a lot of time sort of getting rid of people, having establishment figures who then didn't do what he wanted, and then, they'd go off. So this is the $1 million question, is whether it will be as bad as so many people are expecting.
Well, and on that, Jamie, finally, been hearing sort of good noises out of our new Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, on that score. Obviously, he's trying to cover up for the fact that, he compared Trump to a neo-Nazi supporting lunatic. But, he's saying, I've spoken to the team that are around Trump. I mean, including his VP pick, right? He's gone and met him and says, yes, they seem very competent. They seem like they're ready for government.
Yeah, I think he kind of has to say that, doesn't he, after what he said previously. But I was, interested as well. Boris Johnson obviously met Trump quite recently this week and said that he had full support for Ukraine. And it is a case of wait and see. But I also think it's a case of, with Trump particularly, it will be a whim. Who can predict? It'll be, something will get under his skin about Ukraine and something, or anything like that will mean that he'll switch his opinions in the wind. I can see that he's obviously building a kind of electability or a force around him but I don't see the special relationship between the UK and the US getting any better, particularly after J.D. Vance's, the VP's joke about the UK being the first Islamist country to have nuclear weapons. I foresee a very tricky path for Labour if Trump does win, but also one that involves us being further and further the junior partner.
Okay. Still to come, the DIY test that could save lives, and what is Brat Girl Summer? Leaf's up next after this. If you like this podcast, then you're going to love The Week magazine and its daily digital digests. And now is the ideal time to try it out. With analysis and opinion from across the political spectrum, stay informed this summer with The Week. Enjoy 6 weeks free, then save an extra 30% on a print and digital subscription when you enter the offer code SUMMER24 at theweek.com/offer. Start your free trial today at theweek.com/offer with the code SUMMER24. Okay, Leaf, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Could the smear test be on its way out?
Today I'm going to show you exactly what's happening during your pap smear. A lot of people get nervous about the speculum. The speculum is just a tool that allows us to visualize the cervix. Mine has a little light so you can see what's going on, and I'm going to show you exactly what I'm looking for. Here we are at the cervix. This is a cartoon representation, but they more or less look like a donut. The first thing we're going to do is take a sample from the outside with a little spatula like this that gently brushes the surface and collects a sample of cells. Then we take a little mascara brush type tool and just gently put that right into the cervical os, not far at all, to get a sample of the inside of the cervix. After that, we mix them all up in a little tube, send it to the lab, and you're done.
What happens during a pap smear? A video posted by Dr. Asia Sullivan. Leaf, here we are at the cervix. What's the story?
I actually saw my cervix very recently, which was an exciting experience because I had a smear test and then a follow-up. So a lot of women in the UK don't actually do their smear test when they're invited to it. And that's a real problem because it leads to increases in incidence of cervical cancer. So the NHS is potentially finding a way around this problem. It's done a massive trial, it's been led by King's College London, into these DIY cervical cancer screening kits, which basically are composed of a little swab that you put into your vagina and you kind of rotate it around and get a sample, and then you can post it back to be tested for HPV, which is a kind of collection of bacteria that often cause cancer. I mean, not always, but they generally precede cancer in the cervix. So this trial was trying to look at whether women would take up these tests in greater numbers because it was so convenient, and the results are really positive. And now the NHS is trying to work out whether it can roll out these tests across the country.
Okay, but when you say the results are really positive, the results are really positive of women who enrolled on a test to see whether they do a test at home. I mean, surely self-selectingly those are women who would. The point is, will this address the women who wouldn't? That's
a good point. So, just to give you some numbers, only about 13% of women returned these kits if they were posted to them, but 56% returned the kits if they were given them from their GP. I agree that there might be some sort of skewing in the numbers because people who participate in medical trials tend to be maybe slightly better at maintaining, their health than people who don't want to participate in medical trials. But I still think the likelihood is that this kit will be much more readily taken up by women because it's just so much less invasive than going into hospital, sticking your legs up in stirrups and having a smear test.
Yeah, before I broaden this out to our other contributors, given that all three of us are men, just talk us through a little bit why women are daunted by that. Because even that number that you quoted of GPs handing women these tests and saying do it at home, that still seems quite low. You know, when someone in a white coat says take this home and do it, there's still obviously a reluctance.
Yeah, there is a reluctance. So currently in the UK, it's women aged 25 to 49 who are invited for cervical screenings every 3 years. And if you test positive for HPV, which is these bacteria that I mentioned, there's a follow-up, and if everything's fine, you'll have more regular cervical screenings. But women tend to not like doing it because it's quite unpleasant. I mean, it's not that bad.
It doesn't hurt though, right, is my understanding?
It doesn't hurt massively, but it's pretty unpleasant. They put a gel on this like device that they sort of stick up you, and they sort of then scrape around. And I think a lot of the reasons why women don't want to do it are that it's like a big faff going to hospital to get it done. And also perhaps that they would rather not know. There's this kind of like sticking your head in the sand thing. They might be embarrassed. You know, there are lots of different reasons that people decide not to do it. I think probably one of the big ones is a kind of, I'm too busy. I don't want to go to hospital for what seems like an unlikely chance that I have cervical cancer.
I suppose, Jamie, some people might think, rather than making this sort of easier for people to fit around their lives by sending them screening tests in the post, it almost should be more mandatory. It should be more like, here is your date, you are coming, and not putting so much onus on individuals to arrange it.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. I think also there's a real hesitancy or reticence from the medical community to really update any of the technology or thinking around this. I mean, in general, I know from speaking to the women in my life, there's a kind of generalized dismissal of women's pain. There's a lot of times where women are kind of told that essentially to suck it up. But I read there was an interesting example. There was a kind of rethinking of the speculum that you use in these situations in 2005 when a company called FemSuite designed and patented an inflatable speculum made out of polyurethane, which is the same material that you use to make condoms. It's about the size of a tampon and was expanded once inside the body. There was obviously initial interest from lots of people. There was just little uptake from the medical community completely. The FemSuite director of marketing told the Atlantic doctors and nurses would see it and praise it, but then they just didn't want to take the time to learn something new. There really is, this is such a massive issue. Cancer is obviously a big problem, and we know there are ways that we can solve it, but it does feel a little bit like, and now the onus is on you women to solve this yourself. And actually the medical community should be saying, like, are there new training methods that we can do? Is there ways that women can teach doctors to how to perform intimate examinations? Because a lot of the time it's very clinical, and it's very, in the same way that we see like intimacy coordinators for actors, should we not have the same kind of training for what is an incredibly intimate experience for doctors and those doing the examinations?
I mean, from that point of view, Holden, the male equivalent of this, I suppose, is the prostate exam, right? Which you hear a lot of men in there. How old are you when you get that done? 50, 60, something like that. You hear a lot of men when they have that first experience of having their genitals probed around, kind of making light of, or, clearly leaning into how uncomfortable it was for them. And yet women go through this sort of experience where they're feeling vulnerable, as Leif was saying, for years and years. It does seem like testing at home would be the answer to that. It is obviously more comfortable, and if men could do that for the prostate, I'm sure they would. Has this been tried elsewhere in the world?
There are a few other countries that have switched to at least giving people the option of home testing in the past few years. The Netherlands is one, Australia is another. They introduced self-testing 2 years ago, and by the beginning of this year, a quarter of samples came from DIY testing kits. The health authorities there said the biggest uplift came from the elderly, from people who lived in remote parts of the country, and also from poor communities. And those were all areas where testing rates had previously been very low. So they were very pleased with the way this had sort of given people another way of doing a test. And I think, there's probably some read across to the UK in that, because one of the concerns here is about low testing rates among ethnic minorities, where there may be cultural sensitivities among women going to the doctor, and particularly women going to doctors for intrusive and potentially sexually related examinations. And so I think giving those people, as well as everybody else, the option of doing something more privately and something less intrusively just removes one of those barriers to doing this kind of test.
Another thing that strikes me, Leif, is that, talking about technology that's improved, is that when you do these things now, I mean, to pick a ridiculous example, I was deflating a hot tub earlier today. There's YouTube videos, right? I mean, it seems like a really silly thing, but, COVID showed that experience as well, didn't it? Like, if you're doing things at home and you haven't got someone qualified telling you how to do it, there is now always a really simple step-by-step video of another person like you showing you how to do it.
That is true. But sometimes, even the most detailed instructions don't really help. I did an STD test a while ago, and it involved me having to sort of milk my finger for blood, and I just couldn't really do it.
I've tried to do that before, isn't it?
It's really awful. Yeah, and so some people like me do have difficulties doing things that other people find very easy. And your body can be just a bit different. Like for some reason, maybe my fingers just don't have a huge amount of blood ready to drip into a little test tube. And also, YouTube, I was trying to read up about a condition which I think I may have on YouTube the other day, or watch some videos about it. And inevitably, there were some good NHS videos, but then I was kind of buffeting away all these other kind of crap videos. So it can be quite difficult to navigate the sheer quantity of information about these different kind of conditions and things that we should do for our health.
Yes, and on that, I suppose, a real downside of technology, Leaf, is that there can be disinformation, and perhaps that's one of the reasons that women are not having this done.
Yeah, and one of the problems with smear tests is that they've kind of got a reputation for, being like, oh, I've got my smear test, oh no. When actually, when you go and do it, it's really not that bad. And the idea that, I would get cervical cancer just because I was kind of dreading something that wasn't actually that bad is something that's really encouraged me to just go and get the smear test.
And Jamie, just sticking to cervical cancer, that's caused by the HPV virus, as Leaf mentioned earlier. There's now a vaccine for that.
Yeah, and I mean, it's cutting cervical cancer by nearly 90%. And I think one of the things that is kind of most worrying is that this HPV vaccine is being offered in childhood, and young women who have had the HPV vaccine may need only 1 to 3 cervical cancer screenings in their entire lifetime. But recent statistics from this year reveal that approximately 1 in 6 girls and 1 in 5 boys in England remain unvaccinated by the time they reach year 10. Obviously, COVID played a role in that. Vaccination rates have plummeted while school closures were there, but there's also a kind of hesitancy around vaccination that we've seen in other areas with school kids. But the HPV vaccine and giving it to children was a massive success. It's seen as like one of the best vaccination rollouts that we've had, and I think more can be done to highlight to parents the kind of importance of making sure your kids are vaccinated in this way.
Holden.
Yeah, there was a change to that vaccination programme last year. The HPV vaccine was originally introduced for girls only in 2008 on the basis that they were most at risk from the cancers caused by HPV, even though at a lower rate it does also increase the risk of genital and throat cancers in men as well.
Right.
There was also the idea that men would benefit indirectly from women being vaccinated, because if fewer women had HPV, then they'd be less likely to pass it on to their partners. Last year, that vaccination programme was extended to boys too, partly so that gay men would also be protected, because obviously they wouldn't benefit from immunity among women, but also to raise the general level of herd immunity. The goal is to have 80% of men as well as 80% of women vaccinated, so that the chances of transmission between any two people is pretty small. As Jamie suggested, we're not quite at that level yet, but even so, the general prevalence of HPV has dropped dramatically since the introduction of these programs. I will also just say I have a counterexample to Leaf's finger prick test experience where...
Oh, I bet you're very competent at it. You don't blink.
I had read examples of the difficulty of extracting blood from your finger, and the leaflet that came with the test sort of gave some advice about, put your hand in a bucket of hot water and do star jumps beforehand. So I did all of this, did the finger prick test, and a kind of horror movie style spurt of blood spewed out of my finger all over the table, all over the tablecloth, all over the floor.
Goodness.
That's so bad.
I mean, I should say, I know that there are various different ailments for which finger prick tests are really life-changing, so don't let us put you off. But it takes some getting used to, doesn't it? Milking your own blood, I would agree. Okay, Jamie's up next, and if that's not enough of a tease for you, so is Katy Perry in a Stars and Stripes bikini. That's after this.
She's a sister, she's a mother. Open your eyes, just look around and you'll discover, it's a woman's world and you're lucky to be living in it. It's a woman's world.
Woman's World, the new single from Katy Perry there. Yes, you are still listening to The Week Unwrapped. Jamie, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This was the week we found out that Katy I Kissed a Girl Perry might not be the feminist icon we first thought she was.
You go, girl! You were born to shine. And we're kind of just having fun, being a bit sarcastic with it. It's very slapstick and very on the nose. And with this set, it's like, ooh, we're not about the male gaze, but we really are about the male gaze.
I hope you were following all that. Katy Perry there, dressed as a not very health and safety conscious builder on her Instagram profile on Sunday. Jamie, what is the story?
I mean, it's a fairly generic pop banger about female empowerment that Katy Perry has released this week.
I'm glad you said pop banger. I mean, I think, can we just, before we get into, serious analysis mode,
yes.
It's a decent pop song. I was listening in the car with my kids when it premiered on Radio 2. They were dancing. Now let's tear it apart.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of like, the feeling is like, what's the point? And then she obviously, the video, as like, the listeners won't have been able to see, but it's kind of Rosie the Riveter visuals, bottles labelled whiskey for women, monster trucks, vibrators, bedazzled power tools. And I mean, it's very safe, it's very boring. And I guess it's kind of, stands opposed to, and my kind of story for the week, it stands opposed to the rest of what kind of pop music and music is doing at the moment this summer. There's a phrase called Brat Girl Summer, which is a kind of lifestyle, but it's basically a push for hedonism over kind of clean living in lots of ways. And it was kind of marketed first by the album Brat by Charlie XCX, and kind of new version of what the feminine ideal is. So Katy Perry obviously got slated for this week, and then came out with that video that we heard earlier about how actually it's satire. And as of course people were saying on the internet, one of the great hallmarks of satire is when you have to release a long follow-up video that explains in detail specifically how you're being satirical and why you chose to do it.
So the video for Woman's World is her at a urinal with other sort of model-looking, conventionally attractive women, really souped up to the eyeballs, right? And then there's her, I mean, I don't even know to describe exactly what's happening, clinging onto a helicopter. I mean, it's pretty full-on pop stuff, right? But she says, despite the lyrics about, female empowerment and it being about intelligence, it's a parody of what men watching the video would expect feminism to look like. Is that it?
Yes, and she says it's a kind of reset for what she is about to tell us she now thinks of as feminine divine. Well, I mean, obviously you have to wait and see what's going on. And it's partially also about a kind of changing of the guard. Katy Perry is obviously very much a kind of early 2010s, late 2000s kind of pop star, in the same way that, Beyonce was. And this idea of a kind of girl boss feminism, which has been existing for a while. But the kind of movement has slightly moved on now, and it seems to jar massively with what Brat Girl Summer talks about. Artists like Chapel Roan, like Sabrina Carpenter, who I'd really recommend people go and listen to for a kind of way of being knowing and understanding of pop music and some of the kind of themes of it without having to shove it down your throat, I guess.
I think what Jamie's basically saying is, if you are an attractive, empowered young woman, you can just be that without singing about it in the lyrics.
Yeah, the lyrics really made me cringe. I don't feel badly towards Katy Perry. I think she's quite fun, and she's made some really great pop tracks, but this one is landfill pop in my view. Kind of emphasizing that women are intelligent and strong is so boring. It kind of, I just oh my god, I kind of came out of a coma having watched that, like when you stop the video, because it's just so dull. And I also think that after a certain point, when you're saying that something is a satire, but ultimately it's reproducing all of the images and poses that are harmful to women, such as there's a clip of her boobs just bouncing in her little itty bitty bikini. She thinks that's satirical, and maybe I'm being too po-faced, but it's also just kind of bums me out, and the mood is depressing. And so even if she's kind of trying to be clever, I don't think it really works. Also, that clip where she kind of explains that there's a reset and the feminine divine. If you actually wrote it down, what she's saying, it's completely unintelligible. Whatever this feminine divine.
It sounded like the presidential debate, didn't it?
Yeah, it sounded like, there's that famous clip where there's this beauty queen who is asked like some sort of question about like foreign policy, and she completely has a strange sort of breakdown and can't say anything intelligible. I think that Katy Perry was bitten by the same virus. She doesn't actually have any thought out vision of what, feminism means, or at least not according to that clip. And so the idea that I'm supposed to actually applaud her or enjoy her song because she's such a feminist is kind of rubbish in my view. I think Charlie XCX and her acolytes and Chappell Roan and Sabrina Carpenter are all doing much more interesting things from a feminist perspective. I'm pro Brat Girl Summer.
It's funny that we're talking about Beyonce in light of this, Holden, because it reminds me, this conversation, a little bit of the conversation we had on the show, 2 months ago, which was essentially, Beyonce's co-opted country music. Is she really country? It's sort of the same in a way, which is Katy Perry is co-opting feminism, but is she really a feminist? And I think, in a sense, the reason that conversation is inevitable in the same way is because they're such huge artists that they're talking to so many people all at once, including children, that trying to make a statement that's just art isn't possible because they have to be so commercial.
Yeah, in looking into this, I started to feel a bit uncomfortable that I was kind of being overly intellectualizing or overthinking something that should just be fun. But I think because there is clearly a message, and because it is clearly a joke, and watching the video, that it's definitely a parody of something. But it's not a particularly good joke, and I'm not sure whose expense it's at. As well as Beyonce and even Dolly Parton, who talked about our love of Dolly Parton on this podcast before. And if you think about 9 to 5, that's doing a much more sophisticated version of this, which has sort
in
of
1986.
And it has sort of frustration and grit alongside the sort of empowerment and celebration. The other thing it made me think about was Barbie and the Barbie film. And I think both in the kind of aesthetic of it and the very broad brush approach to gender and gender roles. And Barbie got some criticism as well for, I think, being a bit more simplistic than people would have expected from a Greta Gerwig film. But compared with this, that has, all the subtlety in the world you could hope for. And, sort of seeing Barbie and Ken's trip from their mirror image world to ours gave her the chance to make some good jokes and make some decent, if not massively groundbreaking points at the same time. But here, saying that it's a woman's world and you're lucky to be living in it, celebrate, we're not going anywhere, is that meant to be ironic? And we're meant to think that in reality clearly it's not a woman's world, and so the video is showing us all the ways in which it isn't. But then it also has the celebration and defiance, which presumably is sincere and not satirical. So is it saying that it really is a woman's world and that equality has been achieved and exceeded? It's just very confusing. And I think it's a sort of very cakeist act of trying to, and the nakedness as well. There's a lot of nakedness. I'm glad I didn't have time to watch this in the office yesterday and had to do it last night at home. Ironic nakedness is still naked.
Jamie, what do you make of it? What does it mean? Why is this your story of the week? Why does it matter?
I think for me, it's a changing of the guard, and it's also a kind of, like you were saying, a co-opting of feminism. We've seen a lot with the reaction to Taylor Swift about what does feminism mean, and is it just a way to sell records? I think it was really interesting what you were saying, Ollie, about it has to appeal to everyone. And I actually think Spotify now, the world of streaming music, actually means that it doesn't need to appeal to everyone. Katy Perry maybe have kind of slightly missed the mark in this, but people like Charlie XCX are succeeding with a new version of pop music that doesn't try to please everyone, that is basically, with Brat, she did a club album, but that also has a kind of massive amount of vulnerability in it. And if you compare it to Beyonce's club album that came out, that was, hit a lot of the same notes, but didn't have that kind of vulnerability that Brat does. Brat talks about ego, about womanhood. There's songs about whether or not she should have a child and what it feels like to be 30-something woman, but yet still feel like she's a girl inside. While it is very obviously marketable to a TikTok generation, and there are TikTok dances to things, it is also talking about very important things for young women at that moment. The reason that I bring it to the table is that Katy Perry has basically highlighted the massive shift that has gone on in the last 10 years and that we're now seeing, and that young people, I was talking to my cousin and her friends who are all 22, 23, and they have got zero time now for that kind of girl boss feminism stuff that was around 10, 15 years ago. Now it is all about obviously having a really good time. No one can disagree that Chappell Roan, Sabrina Carpenter, Charlie XCX are making music that you want to have a dance to, but you also want to have a bit of heart behind. And I think it's an incredible shift that we're seeing.
Well, okay, so you want a bit of heart behind it, but again, I just return Leaf to the fact that I heard it on Radio 2 with my kids in the car, and I do think, that is what's different, isn't it, about Katy Perry from those other artists? She's being playlisted in those places. She's being playlisted on Fun Kids. In a way, her target audience is like 7 and 8 year olds. So can you just overthink this?
I think, you can overthink this. But, as we were talking, I was thinking about the fact that whatever Katy Perry has said about and the irony and the satire of that video, the people watching it are sort of 7. They probably won't necessarily have imbibed the discourse around it. So they won't see it as ironic. They'll just see a pair of boobs shaking around in a little bikini, like they'll be like, oh look, that's being a sort of feminist and being a woman involves kind of sprawling on the floor and offering up my body to the male gaze. The kind of feminism that Katy Perry espoused in the 2010s with like I kissed a girl and I liked it, OMG, like isn't that naughty, has been overtaken by more complicated feminisms and that are coming through in pop music. And I'm really happy that kind of quite basic feminism is being shown up for being really quite inadequate now.
Holden, do you feel any more equipped than you were 10 minutes ago to be able to identify the tropes of a brat girl summer as you walk around this season?
It was a relatively new concept to me. We did cover it in one of our daily digital editions, I think as a word of the day a couple of weeks ago, so it wasn't entirely new. But yes, the brat girl summer is an interesting idea, and I did like the idea that this was some sort of reaction against COVID and lockdowns and the kind of lack of socialising opportunities. I did, though, enjoy a column by Rebecca Reed in the iPaper where she talked about having lived her own brat summer a year in advance last year, and she is now much more drawn to a Daphne du Maurier summer where she was planning long coastal walks in sensible jumpers, plenty of reading, and then a nice dinner party. So I think I might swerve the brat summer entirely and just skip straight to that.
Right. Okay, well, I'm actually off to Germany now, so maybe I'm having a Bertolt Brecht summer. But thank you to Holden, Jamie and Leaf. You can follow this show for free. You can get every episode as soon as it's released by searching for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts and then tapping follow. You can also get 6 free issues of The Week magazine with a trial subscription. Just go to theweek.com/subscriptions. In the meantime, I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer, Ollie Peart, at Rethink Audio. And as I said, I'm off on my holes for a couple of weeks. Arian will be here in the meantime. Auf Wiedersehen.